June 6, 1944. The dawn broke cold and grey over the coast of Normandy. The sea was restless, the wind sharp, and the horizon filled with ghosts. For months, Europe had waited for this day, the day the Allies would strike back, the day Hitler's fortress would be breached, the day the tide of war would turn. To the men who would live it, it was not a date on a map. It was the longest day of their lives. From the cliffs of Dover to the fields of France, the machinery of liberation had been set in motion. It was called Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. More than 150,000 men, 7,000 ships, 10,000 aircraft. A city of steel and courage, afloat upon the sea. Its goal, to land on the beaches of Normandy, establish a foothold in Europe, and begin the liberation of a continent enslaved by tyranny. But the cost would be unimaginable. For years, the world had watched the darkness spread. Hitler's armies had conquered Poland, France, and much of Europe. London had burned under the Blitz. Millions had been murdered in camps whose names the world did not yet know. Now, at last, the Allies would strike. In London, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, calm but sleepless, looked out across the map of Europe. Every arrow, every line, every red circle meant lives. If the invasion failed, it could doom not only an army but the dream of freedom itself. On the night of June 5, the order was given, "We go." Across the English Channel, soldiers waited, British, American, Canadian, French, Polish, from farms and cities, from every corner of the free world. Some prayed. Some wrote letters they would never send. Others stared into the black water, wondering if they would ever see home again. They did not know that the next sunrise would change history. They only knew that it might be their last. The invasion was not meant for June 6. Originally, the Allies had planned to land days earlier. But the weather over the Channel had turned violent, waves high, winds unrelenting, clouds thick with rain. The meteorologists warned that to sail would be suicide. Eisenhower faced the hardest decision of his life. Thousands of ships, millions of lives, the fate of Europe, all waited on the weather. In the early hours of June 5, in a small room lit by a single lamp, his commanders gathered. The forecast was grim but held one window of opportunity, a brief break in the storm the following morning. If they delayed again, they might have to wait weeks. Every day of delay gave Hitler time to strengthen his defenses. Eisenhower looked at his generals, Montgomery, Ramsey, Lee-Mallory, and then at the table before him. His hand trembled slightly as he spoke. "Okay. Let's go." With those words, history moved. The order raced across England. Convoys began to roll. Men poured from barracks, equipment was loaded, ships assembled at the coast. Across the Channel, German troops slept behind concrete bunkers, unaware that a storm greater than weather was coming. The soldiers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions checked their weapons in the dark. Painted with black stripes and faces smeared with mud, they climbed into C-47 aircraft bound for the night sky over France. At 11 p.m., the engines roared to life. The sky filled with hundreds of planes, a river of wings stretching from horizon to horizon. One paratrooper wrote in his diary, "We were scared, sure. But it wasn't fear of dying, it was fear of failing." Below them, the Channel churned with ships, landing craft, destroyers, transports, an armada larger than any seen before or since. Its lights vanished into the darkness, swallowed by wind and sea. On shore, German radar picked up faint signals but dismissed them as ghosts of the storm. By midnight, the first paratroopers were already descending over Normandy, their parachutes white against the black clouds, their hearts pounding in the night. The waiting was over. The storm had begun. The first Allied soldiers to set foot in occupied France did not arrive by sea, but by sky. At 12:15 a.m., waves of C-47s crossed the coastline, carrying thousands of paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne, and the British 6th Airborne Division. Their mission, to seize bridges, roads, and causeways behind enemy lines, to cut German reinforcements before the beach landings began. But the night was chaos. Wind scattered the paratroopers across miles. Many landed in flooded fields, drowning under the weight of their gear. Others fell into enemy positions, captured or killed before they touched the ground. Still, they fought. Small bands of soldiers, isolated, confused, leaderless, regrouped and attacked. One group captured the vital Pegasus Bridge, holding it against repeated counterattacks. Another destroyed a German battery that could have annihilated the beaches. Everywhere, scattered men became armies of determination. As dawn approached, the sea turned white with foam. The first landing craft appeared on the horizon. Naval guns roared from miles offshore, pounding the coast. The sky was filled with aircraft, their engines droning like thunder. At 6:30 a.m., the first waves hit the beaches. Utah and Omaha for the Americans. Gold and Sword for the British. Juno for the Canadians. German defenders, 50,000 strong, waited in bunkers and on cliffs, behind barbed wire and concrete. Their machine guns opened fire the moment the ramps dropped. For the men inside the boats, it was hell. Bullets tore through water. Explosions threw bodies into the surf. The sea turned red. Medics tried to pull the wounded ashore only to be shot beside them. Still, they came. Wave after wave, through smoke and shrapnel. One officer shouted above the roar. "If you make it to the sand, you've already won half the battle." By mid-morning, the beaches were chaos, littered with tanks, bodies, and shattered equipment. Yet, inch by inch, the Allies pushed forward. Engineers cleared mines. Soldiers crawled beneath gunfire. Officers rallied survivors behind the dunes. In the distance, church bells rang faintly from French villages, the first sound of freedom in for long years. The invasion of Europe had begun. The fate of the world now rested on the courage of men fighting not for glory, but for each other. Of all the beaches on D-Day, one would become legend, a nightmare. Omaha Beach. It was here that the cost of freedom was paid in full. At dawn, the men of the 1st and 29th U.S. Infantry Divisions approached the French coast in small landing craft. The sea was rough, the wind unrelenting. Seasickness gripped many before they even saw land. When the grey outline of the cliffs appeared through the mist, they saw no movement, only silence. Then, as the first ramps dropped, the world exploded. Machine guns opened from the bluffs. Artillery from inland batteries rained down. Entire boats vanished under water before a single man reached the sand. Soldiers jumped into the surf, weighed down by 70 pounds of gear. Many never resurfaced. Those who did were met by a storm of bullets. Water churned red. Bodies floated beside shattered tanks and equipment. Officers shouted orders no one could hear. Radios failed. Smoke blinded. Chaos ruled. For the first hours, the beach was a slaughterhouse. Men took shelter behind obstacles, the tide rising to swallow the wounded. A sergeant crawled ashore carrying only a handful of grenades, whispering, "We'll make it, boys. Just get off this beach." And somehow, they did. By mid-morning, small groups began to move, engineers clearing mines, riflemen crawling through surf, demolitions teams blowing gaps in the seawall. They climbed the cliffs, inch by inch, under fire. One by one, the German machine guns fell silent. At Point du Hoc, U.S. Rangers scaled sheer cliffs with ropes and bayonets to destroy enemy artillery. Many never came down. Those who did raised a single flare, the signal that the guns were gone. By afternoon, the Americans had carved a narrow foothold, 100 yards of blood and courage. Omaha Beach was theirs. General Omar Bradley watched from offshore and said quietly, "It's as close to hell as men can get." Of the 34,000 who landed there that day, more than 2,400 became casualties. But they had done what seemed impossible, they had breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall. While Omaha bled, other beaches fought their own storms. To the east, the British 3rd Division and Canadian 3rd Division came ashore at Sword and Juno. Their objectives: capture Caen, secure the eastern flank, and link with airborne troops holding the bridges inland. At Sword, British commandos landed under heavy fire but moved with precision. Their leader, Lord Lovat, marched calmly ashore wearing a green beret and carrying a rifle. Beside him, his piper, Bill Millin, played Highland Laddie as bullets whistled overhead, a sound that would later echo in history. The commandos stormed German positions, cleared the coastal batteries, and advanced inland toward the bridges captured by the 6th Airborne. When they met, Lovat saluted and said, "Sorry, we're 2 minutes late." At Juno, the Canadians faced strong resistance and a minefield of obstacles. Their landing craft hit submerged steel traps. Men leapt into the surf, pulling comrades free as shells burst around them. Casualties were heavy, 1 in every 2 men in the first wave fell. Yet by noon, they had broken through. Canadian troops pushed deeper inland than any other Allied force that day. Villages liberated, crossroads seized, German defenses shattered. By nightfall, the British and Canadians had joined hands across their sectors, creating a solid line of freedom stretching across Normandy's coast. In the midst of ruin, they raised flags, tattered, smoke-stained, but defiant. The beaches of Sword and Juno had held. The first day's objective had been achieved, the Allies were ashore. But the true battle for France had only begun. Above the beaches, the sky was alive with war. From midnight to midday, 11,000 aircraft had crossed the channel, bombers, fighters, gliders, transports. Never before had so many flown for a single cause. Before dawn, Allied bombers struck coastal fortifications, railroads, and bridges. Explosions lit the horizon like lightning. But precision was impossible through cloud and smoke. Many bombs missed their marks. The men below would face fortifications largely intact. As the paratroopers descended, the air itself seemed to fight. Planes were torn by flak, gliders crashed in fields, parachutes burned in the night. Yet wherever they landed, in swamps, in orchards, in enemy villages, they fought as if surrounded by thousands. One airborne captain, wounded and alone, rallied stray soldiers from 5 different units. He pointed toward the sound of gunfire and said, "We're not lost, the enemy is." They seized a crossroads, holding it until relief arrived 2 days later. In the skies above the beaches, fighters dueled at dawn, Spitfires and Mustangs against Messerschmitts. The roar of engines never ceased. Allied pilots strafed convoys, cut communication lines, destroyed railways. By noon, the Luftwaffe had all but vanished from Normandy's skies. It was said that day that if you see a plane overhead, it's ours. But victory had a price. Hundreds of aircraft never returned. The sea was dotted with wreckage and oil fires. Paratroopers lay tangled in trees, rifles still in hand. In the command ships off the coast, generals watched through binoculars as waves of reinforcements came ashore. One officer whispered, "We've done it." Another replied, "No, we've only begun." The sky above Normandy had rained steel, but beneath it, something fragile and miraculous was forming, a foothold of hope, a beachhead of freedom. The Allies had not just landed in France. They had landed in history. Long before the first Allied soldier set foot on Normandy's sand, a quieter army was already fighting in the shadows. They called themselves La Résistance. Men and women, farmers, students, teachers, priests, who refused to bow to occupation. For 4 years, they had lived in whispers and danger, carrying false papers, passing coded messages, and striking blows where no army could reach. When word of the invasion came, whispered through secret radio broadcasts from London, hidden in the coded phrase "the dice are on the carpet," they knew the hour had come. In the forests of Brittany and the hills of Normandy, the resistance rose. They blew up rail lines, ambushed convoys, cut telephone wires. Trains carrying German reinforcements derailed in flames. Bridges collapsed under saboteurs' charges. The enemy's arteries were being severed, one by one. In a small village near Caen, a schoolteacher named Lucy Aubrag gathered her students into the cellar and told them to cover their ears, as the sky above roared with Allied planes and the ground trembled with explosions. When it was over, she walked outside, saw the first parachute falling, and whispered, "Ils sont là, they are here." The resistance also became the Allies' unseen eyes. They guided paratroopers through the countryside, hid wounded soldiers in barns, and pointed the way to German strongpoints. In some places, they fought side by side with British commandos and American scouts. They paid dearly. Court members were tortured, executed, or sent to camps. Entire families vanished into the night. But even under the threat of death, their resolve never broke. General Eisenhower later said that the resistance shortened the war by months. Their courage could not be measured in divisions or guns, it was measured in acts of defiance, in every life risked to make freedom breathe again. In the end, the liberation of France began not on a beach, but in the hearts of those who had refused to surrender. By the second day, the beaches of Normandy were no longer lines on a map, they were living, bleeding cities of men, machines, and determination. The Germans counterattacked swiftly. Tanks from the feared panzer divisions rolled toward the coast. At Carentan, Caen, and Bayeux, the fighting raged in hedgerows and narrow lanes. The Allies had come to liberate Europe, but first they would have to survive Normandy's maze. Rain turned the roads to mud. Fields became traps. German snipers haunted every farmhouse, every church steeple. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards. Yet, the Allies held. Naval guns from offshore pounded enemy positions. Engineers built makeshift harbors, the Mulberry ports, where ships could unload supplies even without a real harbor. Thousands of tons of food, fuel, and ammunition poured ashore. Every hour, more men landed. By the end of June 6, over 150,000 soldiers had crossed the Channel. By June 12, that number had doubled. The beachhead, once fragile as breath, had become unbreakable. German General Erwin Rommel had warned Hitler months before, the first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. For the Allies, as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day. If we do not win it, we will lose the war. By nightfall of June 6, Germany had lost it. But the fighting did not end. The front lines crawled forward, village by village, hedge by hedge. Normandy became a graveyard for tanks and men alike, a labyrinth of mud and blood where every field was paid for twice. Still, the beachhead held. The tide of history had turned and would never retreat again. Victory came with a sound, the quiet, ragged breathing of men who had lived through the impossible. By the end of D-Day, the beaches of Normandy were secure, but at a cost so staggering it defied comprehension. More than 10,000 Allied casualties. Over 4,400 dead. Thousands more missing, never found. The sand was littered with helmets, rifles, and torn letters from home. The tide rolled in, washing over the bodies of the fallen, carrying away the blood but not the memory. Survivors sat in silence, staring at the horizon where the next wave of ships approached. Some smoked cigarettes with trembling hands. Others dug shallow graves for friends who had fallen beside them. One American medic wrote in his diary that night, "The sea is full of our boys. They look so peaceful, floating face up, as if asleep. I don't know how to pray anymore." French villagers crept out from hiding to meet the soldiers, offering bread and wine with tears streaming down their faces. A little girl placed flowers on the chest of a dead paratrooper, whispering, "Merci." The cost of freedom had been paid, not in speeches or medals, but in flesh and silence. In London, Churchill received the first reports. He wept quietly, then told Parliament, "We have entered upon a great enterprise. We shall not falter. We shall not fail." The world had waited for this moment for 5 years. It had come at a price beyond measure. But from the beaches of Normandy, hope rose like the tide, slow, relentless, unstoppable. The foothold was secure. The liberation of Europe had begun. The beaches were secure, but victory did not lie on the sand. It lay beyond the hedgerows, in the heart of occupied France. For weeks after June 6, the Allies pushed inland through Normandy's countryside, a patchwork of fields bounded by thick earthen walls and tangled hedges known as the bocage. Every hedge was a fortress, every farmhouse a potential ambush. German troops fought with savage tenacity, supported by the 88mm guns that had once dominated Europe. Panzer tanks prowled narrow roads, their engines growling like beasts in the fog. Progress came in inches, bought by blood. American and British units moved under constant artillery fire. Air support was limited, the fighting was too close, the smoke too thick. Villages changed hands by the hour. The smell of gunpowder mingled with the scent of crushed grass and burning fuel. Still, they advanced. On July 9, after a month of brutal combat, British and Canadian forces finally reached the outskirts of Caen, a city whose ruins smoldered under days of bombardment. The liberation was not joyous. Civilians wept amid rubble, churches burned with their bells still ringing. One French priest wrote, "Freedom arrived through fire, but we welcomed it all the same." To the west, the Americans broke through near Saint-Lô in a storm of bombs and tanks. The explosion of Operation Cobra shattered the German lines. Within days, the Allies poured into open country for the first time since D-Day. The front moved fast now, like a tide released from its bottle. Convoys stretched for miles. Paratroopers rode atop tanks waving to villagers who cheered and wept. The road to Paris had opened. And behind them, the beaches of Normandy were no longer battlefields, they were sacred ground. War is as much gamble as it is plan. By August 1944, the German army was retreating across France, but retreat was not defeat. Their generals planned one final stand near the town of Falaise, hoping to trap the advancing Allies in a pocket of steel and fire. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, and Patton faced a decision: push forward and risk encirclement, or close the trap and crush the German army once and for all. They chose the gamble. For 10 days, the Falaise pocket became a furnace. Bombers darkened the sky. Artillery pounded day and night. The Germans fought like cornered wolves, but the Allies closed in from all sides. When the smoke cleared, the roads were choked with wreckage, tanks twisted like skeletons, horses and men buried in ash. Tens of thousands of Germans were captured. The Wehrmacht in France was broken. From there, the liberation rolled like thunder. Patton's Third Army advanced so fast his tanks outran their fuel. French armored divisions under General Leclerc swept toward Paris. And on August 25, 1944, the city rose. Church bells rang for the first time since 1940. Crowds flooded the streets, waving flags long hidden beneath floorboards. French resistance fighters clashed with the last German troops. The tricolour flew once more over the Eiffel Tower. When General Charles de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées, the crowd roared, tears streaming. In the background, the guns still rumbled, a reminder that though Paris was free, Europe was not yet whole. Hitler, enraged, ordered the city destroyed. His generals disobeyed. Paris would live because men of conscience refused madness. The gamble had succeeded. But the war was not yet over. Ahead lay the Rhine, the Ardennes, and the snows of one last winter. Yet from the cliffs of Normandy to the cobblestones of Paris, one truth was already clear. The tide of tyranny had turned. The beaches are quiet now. The tide rolls in, washing over rusted landing craft and the faint outlines of bunkers. Seabirds cry above the cliffs. The wind moves through the tall grass, carrying echoes of voices long gone. 80 years have passed, but if you stand at dawn on Omaha or Juno, you can still feel it, the weight of that morning when the world held its breath. They came not as conquerors, but as liberators. Boys who became men in a single hour, men who never saw another sunrise. Each carried with him the hope of a world without war, and the courage to build it with his own life. The D-Day landings were not just a military victory. They were a moral one. They proved that evil, no matter how vast, could be opposed. That unity, no matter how fragile, could prevail. That freedom, though costly, was worth every sacrifice. General Eisenhower visited Normandy after the war. Standing among the white crosses of the American cemetery, he said softly, "These men gave us a chance. They bought time for our children to live in peace. We must not waste it." Each grave faces west, toward the ocean they crossed. Each name tells a story that ended so others could begin. In the decades that followed, the nations they freed rebuilt, reconciled, and remembered. Europe rose from ashes into light. And though war would never leave the world entirely, that morning in June remains a beacon, proof that humanity, even in its darkest hour, can rise together for something greater. The sun climbs slowly over Normandy. Its light spills across the quiet water, the same water that once ran red. History remembers the date, June 6, 1944. But the memory belongs to the men who made it possible. They called it D-Day. We call it the dawn of freedom.